So in the last segment, we spent a lot of time talking about reopening schools, which, by the way, I didn't mention this before, but is important to bringing the economy back so that parents have a place reliably where their children can go during the school day later this year. But with that said, what is the current state of the economy, particularly for small business? Where are things at? What needs to be done in order to jumpstart small business and the economy? To talk about this, I'm pleased to welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads, Elaine Parker, who is Chief Operating Officer at the Job Creators Network and rejoins us here on the program. Welcome to the show. Good to talk with you, Elaine.
Great to be here, Jimmy. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So let me jump right into it with the first sort of broad question, because we've seen spikes happening across the country in terms of COVID cases, particularly in states like Florida and Texas, Arizona, and California. Given that, but also given the struggles that businesses, especially small businesses, have been dealing with, what are you noticing as the current state of affairs for the reopening and how businesses are faring right now?
I mean, look, there's certainly a reason to take a step back and look at some of the spikes around the country and examine what we're doing and what's contributing to some of the spikes. I actually am in Florida, so I've been paying very close attention to not only schools opening, but how they're going to approach that. And actually, I'm in Orlando. The school board today is voting on what their plan is, because the governor has said we will reopen. And we will reopen with in-person learning and some combination of that. So my kids are really happy to go back to school, and I think it's best for them. I mean, the American Pediatric Association have said that it is in the best interest of children to go back to school. I think that is an endorsement in and of itself. And all of the data that we have so far, I mean, over the last 3-4 months of this pandemic shows that children have a relatively low risk of not only getting the disease, but spreading it as well. They don't seem to be the super spreaders that we originally thought. And they have a very, very low risk of mortality with the virus. So if we follow the standard procedures with the CDC, I think we have a very good opportunity here to get our kids back in school and get some normalcy back for them. They really need it. I mean, for some kids, those are their meals that they get for the day. Lower income kids, I mean, they get breakfast and lunch at school. And for kids who are on the lower income spectrum, sometimes for them, not being in school means not getting school at all. So this is really hurting kids on a wide range of ways. From depression, I could go down the list.
Yeah. Well, and I want to stick with schools. I appreciate you starting there, Elaine Parker, especially because I just went and did a whole monologue on the need to reopen schools, and also how the U.S. Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is going about this, saying, here's the guideline, reopen schools. How you do that and the extent to which you do that is up to you, the local communities, which I think is the way we should be looking at basically every education issue that we experience across the country. But I do want to go into your point about the spread and the health risks here. There was a remarkable, and we played the full report, but there was a remarkable report on MSNBC interviewing 5 different pediatricians across the country who said exactly that. And I just want to play the last 30 seconds or so of this clip from MSNBC.
I will. My kids are looking forward to it.
Yes. Period. Absolutely.
Absolutely. As much as I can.
Without a hesitation.
Without a hesitation, yes.
I have no concerns about sending my child to school in the fall.
I would let my kids go back to school.
Dr. John Torres, NBC News.
They all said yes.
You could see sort of surprise on his face. They all said yes, but there are 5 pediatricians echoing what the association has said, Elaine.
I would call it disappointment on the reporter's face in hearing pediatricians say that. And it is across the board. We work with a lot of physicians on our Flatten the Fear campaign, and that's to help educate the Americans that it is safe for us to reopen society. For the bulk of us, for those in vulnerable populations, they need to be a little more careful and probably continue isolating. But all of our doctors are out there talking on a regular basis about these statistics and specifically about reopening schools. And they all, across the board, say that they want to get their kids back to school. They have no hesitation. And there's no reason why children shouldn't and couldn't be in school right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think going to the idea that Job Creators Network is putting forward of flatten the fear, I think that's a great pun, play on words here with what we've seen with flatten the curve, but it also is critical because there is so much of that fear. I mean, there are some parents who are just saying, I'm not sending my kids to school. And I don't think that it is simply because of like a genuine scientifically based concern. I think it is much more because that fear has been ginned up in these particular areas. And so that's why you see a lot of people are just reflexively saying, no, we shouldn't. Or you have teachers that are saying, no, we shouldn't be told to go back to school, similarly to how, I don't know, grocery store workers have actually had to show up at work.
It's interesting. The media has done a fantastic job at scaring the public, and they do it with very scary headlines. I mean, on Saturday, I get all these 20 notifications from different news organizations that I get, headlines from on my phone saying, 15,000 cases reported on Saturday, the record high. No state ever had that as many. But then I thought, okay, let me look at the numbers. So I went on to the Department of Health website and looked at the numbers, and they have a dashboard, and it's very clear. And Governor DeSantis does almost a daily news conference to explain the numbers. Well, we tested 146,000 people. I don't think any other state in the country tested that many people either. And it was also the third day in a row that our positivity rate went down. So we do continue to see the positivity rate go down, but the more the media scares people, the more the people are going and actually getting tested and finding out that not only do they have COVID, but they're asymptomatic and they're perfectly, walking around fine. And so that is increasing the numbers as well. But Governor DeSantis has done a great job. He's set up drive-through testing. You don't need to have any symptoms. You don't have to be sick. You don't have to have a referral. You just show up, you get tested. But because of all this fear, people are literally lining up at like 4:00 in the morning at the Orange County Convention Center here in Orlando. And it's hours and hours and hours of waiting because of the fear. I mean, can you imagine?
But in the end, they're still getting tested, which is a fundamental point. Like, they're not being turned away, at least to your knowledge. They're not being turned away and told, sorry, we don't have any more tests. They may have to wait for hours, but they're still getting tested, which is critical, especially to critics, for example, of Governor DeSantis in your home state of Florida. Again, we're talking with Elaine Parker with Jobs Creators Network. So in terms of education and reopening schools, and in terms of testing, I mean, those are two things that really can help to bring back the economy, especially those small businesses that are trying to figure out how do we get things going again when kids might be at home for an extended period of time. And that's fundamental. Let's talk a little bit more about the small business side and how some of the things we're talking about are playing into the situation.
Yeah, I mean, getting kids back to school is the first step towards normalcy for all parents. If you've got young children and you're trying to work, it's great if you're in a job that you could work from home. So imagine having a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old, or having to teach your third grader and do your job at the same time. I mean, the difficulty there is, we certainly have a greater appreciation for our teachers right now, but teachers aren't trying to do another job and teach our children, and that's their job. And it's been very difficult for parents to play these dual roles. I have a high schooler and a college student, so they're very independent. But my brother has a son who is 7 years old and autistic, and by being at home and not being able to attend his special needs classes, he's regressed. He can't do online learning, distance learning, like a mainstream school child can. He needs that in-person engagement with his teachers. Fortunately, he's in Georgia, and Governor Kemp, just like Governor DeSantis, has been very aggressive in setting guidelines and reopening the state. And so he's gotten back to school, but he has regressed. And that's a big deal for a 7-year-old at his stage of the game.
Oh, yeah. I was talking about a scenario where you can imagine a kid is sent home from school midway through or early on in their second semester of second grade. They finish it online, and then they're told, beginning of third grade, you can't go back to school. Well, my understanding is the research shows quite unequivocally that third grade is that critical point for developing reading skills. And if you're basically absent for the classroom for almost the equivalent of a school year between the end of your second grade semester and and of course the third grade, the third grade semester, that can be catastrophic in terms of long-term implications for your reading ability. Just talking about reading in third grade, that's just that alone.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've had anybody in third grade in my house, but that was the pivotal year for reading, and that if they didn't hit certain benchmarks, they were held back in third grade. So it is a very important year. And look, every year is important for these kids. Normalcy is important for these kids. Sports, extracurricular activities. My daughter dances. You know, she's on a dance team at school, and she's part of the leadership of the team. And she's missing all of that, and they missed all the recitals at the end. And there's just there's such a huge societal cost to what is being done, and the fear that is being instilled by the media and driven, by some governors who want to keep their state shut down. You know, I'm sorry for California and what the governor has decided for LA County, because those kids are going to be very much. They're going to lose this year of school, another at least half year of school. And that's very unfortunate for them that the governor is not putting these children first.
Well, I mean, gosh, the teachers union there, though, they will insist that you cannot reopen the schools until you defund the police in Los Angeles and I guess reallocate that money towards K through 12 education or something. They insist upon Medicare for all, total, just non sequiturs to what's going on here and to getting kids back into the classroom. And one thing, going to the point about parents working from home, I don't have any children myself, but I've talked with parents of small children who said, look, we're doing our best. We were doing our best, and we still are now that even school's been over, to teach our young kids who are in 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, there is work dad, work mom, and then there's dad and mom, where you can start being more, involved and that sort of thing. You could bug me more when I'm not in work mode. And that, I understand, is a very challenging thing for kids to understand. And I may not have, children of my own, but for many years when I was in high school and middle school, I babysat, and I also ran an educational nonprofit where I was in dozens of fifth grade classes teaching the Constitution to 10-year-old kids. I at least have a better sense than some of the talking heads who may not have children of their own. But I think these are some important things to keep in mind.
So my kids are upstairs right now trying to be very quiet, but they're teenagers, so they can figure it out a lot easier than a 7-year-old could. Right. So yes, all of those challenges exist for everybody. And I've been on more Zoom calls where you've got, a little person running behind or a dog barking in the background.
3 interview guests that have been interrupted by little kids. Adorable, makes for great, televised content, but still.
Yeah, I mean, all of those challenges, and it certainly shows that we're all human, and we all have a life and all of that. I've been on a couple Zoom calls where I have one doctor in Kentucky as part of the Flatten the Fear campaign, and her son, I think he does it on purpose. He's 11. He seems to get right behind her and wave at the camera.
That's on purpose, if you're waving at the camera. But so let's just talk about what small businesses need in order to get things jump-started again, especially with these spikes that we are seeing. I mean, obviously, we're talking about reopening schools, a job creators network. What else do you guys think need to be done in order to get things going again? For real.
Yeah, so the great thing about this administration is the fundamental economic policies that have been in play for the last 3 years and provided a prosperity that we haven't seen in half a century for every single demographic across the board. Those policies still exist. And what we're seeing as states start to open, we saw May jobs numbers, 2.5 million. Come back. Last month for June, we saw 4.8 million. The unemployment rate continues to drop. It's at 11.1%. We have every reason to believe that July will be very positive as well. But small businesses getting back up on their feet, even with the Paycheck Protection Program, which has been a godsend for them, they still need more assistance. And what we're getting behind is not necessarily another big spending package, because we think that there's enough stimulus in the system in taxpayer dollars. What we'd like to see is let's let small business owners and their employees keep more of their own money by cutting the payroll tax and eliminating the payroll tax. Very targeted and temporary, though. We'd like to see it for about a year for small businesses that have under 100 employees. And that would cover about 98% of all small businesses. So you've got employees that would get right off the bat a 7.5% increase in their pay. And then employers who pay the other side of the payroll tax would be able to keep that 7.5% that they match and put towards their recovery efforts and getting their businesses back up and running at 100%. And for people who are self-employed and paid both sides, the 15%, it's 15% more of their own hard-earned money that they get to keep. So instead of a taxpayer-funded stimulus package, we're just advocating for people to keep their own money and be able to recover that way and let the free market start to work for us now that we're trying to get back up and running.
Something else that would seem wise is to cut more red tape. I mean, already we saw during the earlier days of the crisis where there were a lot of politicians, even Democrats, who were saying, well, temporarily we're going to remove this regulation and that regulation. My view is they should expand that and make it permanent. If it's not necessary during a crisis, it's probably not necessary at all.
I mean, that's a great point. And there's been an extraordinary amount of red tape cutting by President Trump during the pandemic. And we certainly support if you didn't need it during a pandemic, you don't need it at all. But that's one of the least told stories about this administration is the regulatory relief that the administration has brought to small business. It's probably been as powerful, if not even more powerful, than the tax cuts because it has just unleashed small business in a huge way. And you think about it, small business owners are the chief cook and bottle washer. I mean, they do everything. They don't have floors of lawyers and accountants to help them navigate all the regulatory red tape burdens that large corporations have. They have to do it all themselves. And that takes resources away from the primary thing they want to do, and that's run their business. So to cut these regulations, and the Trump administration, when they came in, promised for every new regulation they'd cut two. Well, they did one better than that. For every one new regulation, they cut four. So that's a pretty good track record.
Yes.
And we would certainly support keeping the regulations they cut away, because we don't need them to come back.
Yeah, but even some Democratic governors around the country had at least temporarily cut certain red tape points as well, which I found pretty interesting and certainly helps make one wonder, well, okay, if you think during a crisis this regulation should go, why don't you think it should just go all together at all points in time? So it's certainly something to keep in mind. Something else, Elaine Parker, and just a couple minutes left with you, again, our guest, COO at the Job Creators Network, that I want to talk about, and I've talked with Alfredo Ortiz, president of JCN, before about this on the show, liability. There is a concern of business owners across the country. How do we handle the liability issues and so forth? What have you guys been talking about in that regard?
So we would like to see federal action to shield businesses from liability as it relates to COVID. As these businesses start to open, if it's clear that they're following guidelines and they have policies in place for sanitizing, keeping their employees safe, and keeping their customers safe, the reality is this is a very contagious virus. It is more contagious than the flu. Although it's showing to not be as deadly as we thought, and more along the lines of as deadly as the flu. But if they're following these guidelines, we would like to see some liability protections there, because the trial lawyers are swarming, and small businesses, they've already taken just such a hit during this pandemic to then be sued because they have an employee get sick or a customer get sick. It's just, some of this is just out of our hands. I mean, this is this is a black swan event. I mean, we're probably never going to see this kind of event happen in our lifetime, but we've got to protect these small businesses. They just can't take another 1-2 punch.
Yeah, one thing, though, I'm curious about in terms of the federal legislation, this seems like something more easily done at the state level. Is this like federal legislation perhaps to encourage states to make some changes, or what might it entail?
Well, we're seeing some states have taken the initiative to move forward and pass some liability protections, Georgia, Iowa, and most recently North Carolina. But there's not enough movement at the state level by other states. So if we saw federal protections across the board, we think that would not only simplify it, but keep it consistent across the board. So if you're in the restaurant industry and you're following the restaurant industry guidelines to keep your employees safe and your customers, and you know that as long as you followed these guidelines, the federal law protects you from liability concerns, that would be a huge relief to small businesses.
And finally, Elaine Parker, what's one thing about small businesses in this pandemic that you don't think people are talking about nearly enough?
I think that people are not understanding the challenge behind sort of that balance of keeping their employees paid. The Paycheck Protection Program has been helpful, but especially I've used, for example, restaurants again. So if restaurants are still only at a 50% capacity because of their local governments, and they can't have 100% capacity coming in. And even with the social distancing, that limits their capacity anyway, because they've got to take tables away. It makes it difficult for them to be fully staffed up. It makes them difficult for them to pay their rent. And so it still is very challenging for these small businesses that are trying to get up and running to be 100% on one side with their expenses, but they don't have 100% on the revenue side.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Elaine Parker, COO at the Job Creators Network. Thanks for sticking around with us today. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you. Once again, Elaine Parker, COO at the Job Creators Network, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And one thing I want to throw in, going back to the earlier discussion about reopening the schools, remember that each school district can go about this in a different way. And that is critical to making this happen successfully. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.